identifying the goal. For those of you who might have missed that, we are recording this program. So thank you. We just want to be able to document it for in the next 170 years when they want to look back and see what we were doing. So for our goals, we determined that it was really important that we honor our indisputably rich social justice history, no doubt about it. But we also wanted to examine it with a critical eye. We didn't just want to pat ourselves on the back, but we want to look to see what we could have done better and where we need to improve. We need to be honest about our past if we are truly going to live our temple's values into the future. Tonight launches the social justice series with a panel discussion focusing on Black-Jewish relations on the South Side of Chicago, featuring synagogue and community leaders. And we wanted to make sure we had this over the weekend celebrating Dr. King's birthday. This is a subject close to my heart, being a Black Jew who grew up in this temple. The Black community and the Jewish community both have a history of oppression, both have a long history of activism. Sometimes we support each other, like when we came together in the civil rights movement. And sometimes we see Black anti-Semitism, and sometimes we see Jewish racism. There is space and a need for healing. We can answer this call. As we, as a temple, come to understand systemic racism and recognize who generally holds power in society, overlaying all of this is an opportunity and the responsibility to leverage our collective privilege to continue our social justice work and strengthen our march towards equity. I would like to thank the group of people who worked really hard and will continue to work really hard to plan this and all of our social justice events, and in alphabetical order. And if you're here, raise your hand. Ruth Zarnecki-Lichtstein. There you are. Nina Helstein. Larry, her hands is Larry Joseph, Judith Kasi, Beth Sklarski is on Zoom, Nikki Stein, and Erica Walker. Special shout outs go to Joan Pomerantz, Scott Nelson, and Temple staff who worked behind the scenes, and you all don't even know how much work they put in behind the scenes to make this event a success. And so now we go to, yes, let's give them a round of applause. And now to the heart of the event, the panel discussion. Erica Walker will serve as our moderator. And after the panelists speak, we will have a Q&A with audience questions. So if you're in person, please write your questions. You'll see pads of paper on the tables with pens. Please write your questions on those, each sheet of paper. Larry Joseph will collect those sheets of paper and hand them to Erica. If you are on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat and Ruth will send them to Larry, and ultimately they'll make their way to Erica. And if you are in this room, please take a moment to silence your cell phones so everyone can enjoy the discussion without interruption. All right, I am going to introduce Erica. Erica is a licensed clinical social worker and EMDR psychotherapist, a native of Hyde Park and South Shore. Erica holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University with honors in African American studies. She also holds a master's degree in clinical social work from the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. Erica and her husband, Rob, and their sons have been part of the KAM Isaiah Israel community since 2004. Our first panelist will be Rebecca Janowitz. Rebecca holds a law degree from Loyola University, Chicago, as well as a master's degree from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Her extensive and varied professional experience has included serving as coordinator for special projects for Chicago Public Schools and as a special assistant for legal affairs with the Cook County Justice Advisory Council. She's the author of Culture of Opportunity, Obama, Chicago, a book which was published in 2010, which is an innovative examination of the political and cultural history of Hyde Park. And so I will now turn it over to Rebecca.
Good evening. How am I doing with the mic? I fear the mic. I'm a chatty person, but I fear the mic. I just have to mention first my favorite, because I think we're sort of, at least on the edge of political questions, my favorite political reminiscence from the synagogue. When I was much younger, I was listening to Rabbi Maslin speak against the Republicans at, which is always good in my book, at one Jewish occasion or the other. And I was seated behind two elderly women, but very sharp and keeping an eye on things. And he said, vote your pocketbook if you will, but do not wave the flag of Israel to cover your iniquity. Whereupon someone in the congregation stood up and said, how can you desecrate a religious occasion with such a political speech? And the elderly women in front of me started chit-chatting back and forth, and one said to the other, what's he saying? What's he saying? And the first one, the second one said to the first one, he said, I'm condensing this story, believe it or not. He says the sermon's too political. And the first one said, that was too political? He should have been here when Jacob was preaching. And that was the comfort that I always felt at KAM. You don't have to agree with people. You just have to be willing to talk. And you have to be accepting of the fact that politics in one form or another is part of your life. I grew up in a house. My father always felt that my father ran for state representative when we lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to fill out the ticket for Soapy Williams. And he got clobbered. I mean, he had a wonderful time. And after that, he always introduced himself at occasions like this is a failed politician. And he enjoyed that. So I was always happy growing up to be part of congregations where we could talk about these things and we could acknowledge politics, and it was part of your life. And it was not only part of your life, it was a good thing. If you did it right, it was a good thing. And that was always very liberating to me. If you look at the history of this congregation, you can find some wonderful things. And I thought I'd just mention as my part as a sort of ersatz historian, that I would mention a couple of things. In 1939, this congregation espoused when the question of the poor conditions of housing in the Black community came up, they did not do what many other people were doing at the time and do a big long thing about how we should improve housing conditions in the Black community. They said we should have an open housing ordinance. Now, there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell of an open housing ordinance at that year, but the point was to embrace it because it was in fact the solution that was a solution. So that's one little piece of the history that moves me. The second was during World War II, when two women from the community, from the Jewish community, wrote to the lab school. Fruma Gottschalk was one, and I know the name of the other one. It will come to me later on when I don't need it. And they said, look, we're fighting Hitler in Europe. It's embarrassing that we're sending our kids to a segregated school. Why don't you desegregate the lab school? And I think it's interesting that came from two Jewish mothers at the school. And they just looked at the situation and they said, I think it's time we should do that. And they didn't say there's a war on, we'll put this on the list of things to do after we won. I'm very moved by the fact they said, well, let's ask, what can happen? A war will start? There was already a war. So that's the kind of of Jewish tradition that moves me so much when I think about what are the possibilities and what can we do. There's always room to re-examine and to look at what we're doing and to say, well, we should also be doing this, or we should also be doing that. And I find that very gratifying. I've always been very comfortable within the congregations that I've belonged to. And I've always been very grateful to them for extending that degree of comfort. It was extended many years ago to my mother, who was baptized by total immersion when she was 12, growing up in South Dakota, in a region that she actually knew a Jewish person, but she wasn't aware they were Jewish till many, many years later. They were always known as the Russians. So she came to Chicago and eventually got married, and she wanted us to have religious unity in our household. And so she decided she wanted to become Jewish, and she called the local rabbi in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and said, do you believe in conversions for psychological reasons? And he said, why else would you? And she said, this is a religion I can do something with. And it laid the foundation in our family to bring people from very, very different backgrounds together. So that's what I wanted to share to begin with. And the congregation, I have seen congregations take that energy and go into the community and tackle things. And I've been very grateful to see that.
Thank you.
I told you it was a cursed mic.
I love how you started with, we don't have to agree, we just have to talk. And I that's very profound. We're gonna move into our next panelist, and that is Betty Magnet from Rainbow Push. Betty has been a civil rights activist for over 40 years. She's the Illinois political director of the National Rainbow Push Coalition, vice president of citizen engagement for the League of Women Voters of Chicago, and co-chair of Chicago Women Take Action. In 2020, she was awarded the Spirit of 76 Award from the Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organization, IVIPO. And in 2022, she received the Jane Addams Woman of Vision Award from the National Council of Jewish Women, Chicago North Shore. So Betty's portion will consist of a Q&A with Erica. And so Erica, I'm going to turn this over to you to guide us through Betty's thoughts and impressions.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, Betty. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Okay. So I want to start off by acknowledging that you have an extensive history of civil rights activism in Chicago. I'd like to ask you, what insights can you share with us around how your approach to civil rights activism has evolved over time?
So can I start out by saying, thank you?
Of course.
Okay, so I said I couldn't talk without being asked a question. When I listened to Rebecca, I thought about some things.
Yeah.
And I want to start out by saying thank you to KAMI, because Rainbow Push has a home. And we've been there for over 50 years. And it's because you merged. So we have a place to have our Saturday morning forums, we have a place for our office, and I want to say thank you to KAMI, because I don't know where we'd be without it. We marched down there from Shiloh Baptist Church and moved into a place when we've been at 3 or 4 different churches, and we actually honor those 3 churches that gave us a home today, this morning, at Rainbow Push. So to come here and be able to say thank you because you gave us a permanent home is one thank you. My other thank you to my sister from another mother, Donna Gutman. She tells everybody they're sisters, so we're sisters, we just have different mothers. And thank you to all of my CWTA friends, the National Council of Jewish Women, Chicago, North Chicago, for coming to support me because I'm really, really nervous. The other thing is that, to answer your question, it's deep. I guess is the only way I can put it. My first experience with Jewish people was when I went to Hyde Park High School. And when I was there, it was primarily, I want to say 70% Jewish, 20% Japanese. I grew up in a Japanese neighborhood, which is now called Brownsville. Tell me how. And the rest, you know, African Americans. But it was a great experience because I didn't know I was poor until I went to high school and met my classmates who lived in houses with maids and butlers, and they were like really, really well off, and I was shocked because I thought we were like kind of okay until I saw that. So I guess my experience is that one of the things is that I've been around Jewish people all of my life, and what I have learned, very much like what Rebecca said, is that we have similar experiences. My ancestors with slavery, your ancestors with the Holocaust, but we still experience the same racism in America. The only difference is that my color has always been self-evident. So if you changed your name to Smith or some Italian name, no one would know. And you could, as they used to say in the South, pass. But my color has always been self-evident. So there's no way I could go anywhere without someone knowing that I'm African American. But because we have such similar experiences, and Donna and I talk all the time, I have come to really believe Reverend Barrow's saying that we're not so much divided as we are disconnected. And once we get together and communicate, our cultures are different, but if we talk, we can work them out. So that's kind of answer your question.
I really,
I get long-winded.
yeah, no, I really appreciate your answer, Betty, thank you. I have another question, around the work that you've been doing, right, especially as it pertains to social justice work. What are your sources of energy? What are your sources of support? Your sources of motivation? What drives your work?
I think the fact that the work has never been done, is not done yet. For example, we as African Americans, we as women, don't have a national constitutional right to vote in this country. State by state determines what your rights are when it comes to voting. So we are all be contacting our senators and our congresspeople and asking them to give us a national right to vote. Once we get a national right to vote, then states can say whatever they want to say, but they have to give everybody the right to vote in that state. And the fact that that has not happened yet, to me, is reason to keep fighting. It's why I go to Selma every single year. And I'm really kind of looking forward to it this time to see what we can do to help, because they were affected by the tornado yesterday. Fortunately, it did not touch the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which hopefully soon will be called the John Lewis Bridge as the president. Good. I'm done.
Do you want to entertain one more question?
Sure. Sure.
What do you think are ingredients in successful community building, successful connection. What makes strangers into allies?
Similar experiences. So if you can't vote and Rebecca can't vote, we join together and fight for that right. So whenever you have a problem, you know, you always think it's only yours until you talk to someone else and they say, oh, well, I want to do that too. So it's a matter of communication. Communication is so key to everything, and even though our cultures are different, if we talk them out, we understand each other, so we know. I know not to say Jewtown, but I didn't know that when I was a kid, because that's what they said, you know. You know that I'm offended if you talk about my hair, my braids, my kinky hair. But you don't know that that's offensive because you've always heard that. And when you looked at the Little Rascals as a kid, it was funny. But once you grew up, you knew it wasn't funny to me. But that's because if we don't talk, you don't know that. You only know it if you talk to each other. And when you say something that's offensive, I say, oh, that's offensive to African Americans. Or I say something that's offensive and you say, that's offensive to Jewish people. But if you don't say anything, you don't talk to each other, you walk around evil and hating people for no reason at all other than you did not communicate.
Thank you so much for your answer. Thank you.
Wow, we are not so much different. We are not so much divided as we are disconnected.
The late Reverend Willie Barrow used to say that all the time.
I love that. And what turns strangers into allies is communication. Beautiful. And that's consistent with what you were saying. We have to talk.
Fortunately, Jews almost never shut up.
So turning now to our third panelist, it's Jerry Midas, and he is going to join us virtually. So we're bringing in our virtual crowd here. Jerry is a former president of KAM Isaiah Israel, served as the chair of the congregation's history committee for the 150th anniversary celebration, which for those of you who didn't do the math that quickly in your head was 1997 to 1998. The history committee produced a comprehensive history of KAM Isaiah Israel, which was published in a series of 16 installments in the KAM Isaiah Israel Bulletin. Jerry is the retired Chief Regional Civil Rights Counsel for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Region 5, which covers 6 Midwestern states. He holds a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. Now I'll turn it to Jerry.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I hope the technology works. I want to just start by adding to something that Betty said about the connection between Jews and Blacks driven by the history of slavery and the Holocaust. And I want to read briefly from a sermon that Rabbi Jacob Weinstein gave in 1942 called Amos in Times Square. And he gave it on national radio. He had a national radio show on NBC back in the day. And he said, science has cut down the elapsed time between sin and its consequence and thrown its clear white light on the moral anarchy of those who think that a few thousand miles or a few decades can save them from the consequences of their actions. It required 40 years for the sin of the Missouri Compromise to flower into the judgment of the Civil War. It required but a year for the Munich Compromise to bloom into the atonement of World War II. As Lisa mentioned, I had the honor of chairing the History Committee, and 5 of our chapters, which covered the period from the end of World War II to the merger of KM and Isaiah Israel in 1971, were largely devoted to the very hands-on efforts by the congregations, their rabbis, and many individual congregants to address the racial and demographic challenges which affected the communities in which most members of KM and Isaiah Israel lived during that time: Hyde Park, Kenwood, and South Shore. And tonight, I'm going to provide a few highlights from the material in sesquicentennial history. The catalyst for much of the civil rights activity in KM and Isaiah Israel was the May 1948 decision of the United States Supreme Court in the case of Shelley versus Kramer. There, the court unanimously ruled that restrictive covenants in land deeds, which barred the sale of real estate to Blacks, Jews, and Catholics, were unconstitutional. Although lauded in principle, many in Hyde Park, Kenwood expressed concern about how the ruling would affect life in the community in a practical way. Thus, what was often referred to as the campaign, quote, to save the neighborhood, close quote, began. The story starts with a Quaker woman, Julia Abramson, a Hyde Park resident who was very active in the Social Order Committee of the 57th Street Meeting of Friends. In September 1948, under her leadership, the Social Order became the first community group in Chicago to meet with Timothy Wright, the director of the Chicago Commission on Human Relations, to discuss race relations and the integration of a community. As a result, Ms. Abramson convened a general community meeting 2 months later. Several prominent clergymen attended, including KAM Rabbi Jacob Weinstein and Isaiah Israel Rabbi Morton Berman, as well as lay community leaders. The attendees decided to form a new organization called the Hyde Park Kenwood Community Conference, which would be chaired by a prominent Unitarian minister, Leslie Pennington. Both Rabbis Weinstein and Berman would serve on the board. Julia Abramson would serve as the executive director of HPKCC for its first decade. HPKCC was the principal community vehicle through which congregants at both KM and Isaiah Israel committed to racial justice worked during the time. For example, in late 1948, the KM Sisterhood co-sponsored a forum on human relations. In advertising the forum in the KM News, the Sisterhood declared, quote, the struggle of areas throughout the country for intergroup harmony is essentially the struggle of our own community, close quote. In March 1950, Rabbi Weinstein testified before the Chicago City Council on the importance of low-cost public housing. In the same month, KAM hosted Elizabeth Woods, the first head of the Chicago Housing Authority, and Elmer Gertz, a prominent civil liberties attorney, to talk about public housing. In January 1951, Isaiah Israel announced its formal opposition to a referendum whose purpose was to prohibit all public housing anywhere in the city of Chicago. The referendum was to be voted on as part of the February 1951 mayoral and aldermanic elections. Rank and file congregants became very involved in housing justice. For example, KAM member Babette Brody served as the HPKCC observer in housing court. She went to court a couple of times a week to observe all proceedings regarding housing in Hyde Park, Kenwood. She acted as a liaison between the housing inspectors, the City Corporation Council, and the community, trying to make sure that slumlords were kept at bay and housing laws fairly and meticulously enforced. In 1953, the KM News reported that the Marshall Field Foundation had given a joint $100,000 grant to the University of Chicago and the Southeast Chicago Commission, the government entity charged with planning for Kenwood, Hyde Park, and South Shore, quote, to be used in a study of the neighborhood and to aid its conservation, close quote. Both KAM and Isaiah Israel treated this as a strong sign of support and likelihood of success in the effort to maintain a thriving integrated neighborhood in Hyde Park, Kenwood. Although located in the current KAMII edifice, Isaiah Israel took a decidedly South Shore tilt in the 1950s, largely because most of its young families lived there. In September 1952, Isaiah Israel inaugurated the South Shore branch of its religious school at the Horace Mann Elementary School at 81st Street and Chapel Avenues. Throughout the period from 1948 to 1956, Rabbi Berman was up and down in his feelings about the likelihood of Isaiah Israel staying on the South Side. In 1952, he wrote to Rabbi Jacob Marcus, the preeminent archivist at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, that, quote, "Our real problem is that we are faced with a doubtful future in light of the rapid transformation of our community through population changes," close quote. But in 1954, he was much more optimistic, delivering a sermon entitled Hyde Park's Future Assured. In 1957, Rabbi Berman retired early to move to Israel and deal with a different set of problems. Still, Isaiah Israel's South Shore strategy worked quite well throughout the 50s and into the early 60s as the congregation enjoyed considerable strength and growth. But then the bottom fell out as South Shore members began moving in droves to the south suburbs, north suburbs, and north side of Chicago. Although KEM as an institution was strongly dedicated to staying in Hyde Park at its location on 50th and Drexel, all of its members were not similarly dedicated. By 1953, a sufficient number of KAM members had moved from Hyde Park to Highland Park, Glencoe, and Winnetka that a branch, KAM North Shore, was formed. Rabbi Weinstein and his assistant rabbi led Shabbat services on alternate Friday evenings. High Holy Day services were conducted at North Shore Country Day School in Winnetka, and religious school classes were conducted in the Ravinia Elementary School. In 1956, the members of KAM North Shore decided to form their own congregation and sought the services of Jacob Weinstein as their founding rabbi. He was clearly tempted, but many congregants and public officials tried hard to persuade him to stay. The consensus on Weinstein produced a rare moment of agreement between Mayor Richard J. Daley and Fifth Ward Alderman Leon Dupre, a member of KAM, who both asked Weinstein to stay. Weinstein, in a letter to the first president of the new congregation, which was called Congregation Solel, said, quote, "It was a case where a person and a symbol got intertwined, and I found it necessary to respect the symbol." And so he stayed. Instead of Weinstein, Solel's founding rabbi was a 34-year-old University of Chicago doctoral student in Semitics, Arnold Jacob Wolf. In the 1960s, both congregations and many of their most prominent members focused on the national civil rights movement. For example, KAM member Ralph Hellstein, the national president of the United Packing House Workers Union for 2 decades, flew to New York on a monthly basis to discuss strategy with Dr. King. KAM member David Bazelon had been appointed as a member of the United States Court of Appeals in Washington by Harry Truman. By the 1960s, he was widely considered to be the preeminent liberal and most reliable vote in favor of civil rights on the court. In 1962, President Kennedy appointed KAM member Arthur Goldberg to the United States Supreme Court, where he would join in the court's decision upholding the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act. Kol Nidre in 1963 came less than 2 weeks after the infamous bombing of the 16th Avenue Church in Birmingham. Rabbi Weinstein's sermon was titled Atonement of a Nation. Isaiah Israel Rabbi Chaim Gorn Perlmutter's Kol Nidre sermon was called We Shall Overcome, and the next morning he spoke on Deep in the Heart of You. In October 1963, Rabbi Weinstein announced that KAM was available for Black students and their teachers to conduct teach-ins during the Black boycott of the Chicago public schools. There was gross overcrowding in Black schools, while white schools only a few blocks away were often at least half empty. KM stood as a physical alternative to school in, quote, Willis wagons, portable school buildings established by Daley's superintendent of schools, Benjamin Willis, for Black students to address overcrowding instead of integrating the grossly underpopulated white schools. In May 1966, Rabbi Weinstein joined Rabbis Robert Marks and Ernst Lorge in meeting with Mayor Daley to urge him to use Dr. King's planned summer-long fair housing campaign in Chicago to enhance life in the city and to avoid violence. Daley was uninterested. Ultimately, the effort to create an integrated, stable community in Hyde Park, South Kenwood, in which KAM and Isaiah Israels were so integral, was successful. By contrast, few white people were still living in South Shore by 1970. In an interview for the Temple History, Leon Dupre said that Hyde Park Kenwood effort was successful because the area had defined geographic boundaries, 47th Street to 59th Street, Cottage Grove to the lake, strong community groups and religious institutions which were committed to inclusion, and the University of Chicago as an anchor. By contrast, Dupre said South Shore had no defined geographical boundaries, no strong community organizations, no anchor, and most of all, many of its residents were anti-inclusionist who left rather than try to follow the Hyde Park Kenwood model. After the KAM merger in 1971, as Betty already noted, the congregation sold the old KAM building to Operation Push. At the first service under new management in what had been the sanctuary, but was now called Dr. King's Workshop, Rabbi Perlmutter gave the deed to the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Rabbi Simeon Maslin, who had succeeded Rabbi Weinstein in 1967 upon his retirement, gave the first sermon, telling the members of Operation Push that 6 years earlier, Dr. King had spoken in the very same room. On February 5th, 1964, the KM Board of Directors adopted, quote, a reaffirmation of principles, copies of which I believe are available in the room. The preamble read, quote, the resolution of America's race problem is not the exclusive responsibility of any single group, of Negroes or whites, of Christians or Jews, but rather is it the collective responsibility of all Americans. However, Jews have a special commitment to eradicate every trace of racism. The synagogue, the institutionalization of Jewish ideals, must not be a passive participant in the struggle, but must take initiatives and assume positions of leadership, true to the essence of Judaism, that not the word, but the deed is primary. The reaffirmation had originally been drafted by the Social Justice Committee. The board accepted every aspect of it, except a provision which urged congregants not to maintain memberships in discriminatory private clubs, which they deleted. The very detailed commitments that were outlined by the KM board in February 1964 were largely kept by the congregation and the congregants. Many of the specific items in the reaffirmation of principle, such as not patronizing a place of public accommodation like a restaurant that discriminated on account of race, religion, or ethnic origin, pursuing non-discrimination in hiring, and using financial institutions that did not discriminate in their lending practices, became part of the Civil Rights Act signed into President Johnson 5 months later. KM and Isaiah Israel and their members largely, but not always, lived what they believed during those tumultuous times.
Want to read Hyde Park
and engaged Hyde Park history. It's a lovely book. And it's very much from the perspective of someone trying every day to see what they can do that would be useful and helpful, and then looking back on that life experience. So I heartily recommend it.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Jerry. That was incredible. That hearing all about the history, and so, you know, the reaffirmation of principle document is on everybody's, in front of everyone's seat on the table, and an electronic copy is being made available to those on Zoom. I mean, I don't even know, must not be a passive participant. The active supports that our temple had, the intertwining with Push. And you mentioned Ralph Helstein, president of the Meatpackers,
Right.
who went and met with Dr. King on a monthly basis, and Nina Helstein, who's a member of our committee, planning this event, sitting right there, is his daughter. I want to remind everyone that we're going to do Q&A after Rabbi Funay. So if you have pads by you, be thinking about questions you want to ask. You can ask questions for the general panel, or you can ask questions for any specific member. On Zoom, also think of questions, so you can write those down. I want to move now to our final panelist, Rabbi Capers Funay. Rabbi Funay is spiritual leader of Beth Shalom B'nai Zaken, an Ethiopian Hebrew congregation located on the southwest side of Chicago. He's a member of the Chicago Board of Rabbis, as well as chief rabbi of the International Israelite Board of Rabbis. In addition to his rabbinical education, he holds a master's degree in Human Service Administration from the Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies. Rabbi Funay has had a long-standing connection with the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. He joined the JCUA board in 1995 and served as its president from 2016 to 2018. Rabbi Funay, there's a microphone there.
Good evening. Jerry, I have to tell you, you mentioned Rabbi Perlmutter. Boy, my mentor, Arnie Wolf, boy. If you go a little further and hit Ralph Simon, who did an awful lot at Rosh Zedek to maintain the Jewish connectedness with Hyde Park. My goodness. Chicago Sinai congregation, where I would go every year to speak to the sophomore class. I'm over there. I'm forgetting who the rabbi that school on Maryland was named after. 78 in Maryland, I think it was. You see, I'm older. But it'll come back. I think Betty's gonna help me with that.
I'm trying to think of it.
My children attended Akiva Schechter Jewish Day School. I served as the vice chair of the board of Akiva Schechter for several years. And a very strong working relationship with Hyde Park just about all of my adult life. So my children went to Akiva Schechter. Rabbi Ralph Simon was a mentor. Rabbi Vernon Kurtz served as an Ab back then for my families. We didn't call it conversion, we called it reversion. We weren't trying to be Ashkenazi Jews. We were trying to return to what we believe firmly to have been the faith of our ancestors before the transatlantic slave trade. So That's who we are. I've traveled to New York so many times, and I'm so glad my mother left New York when I was 2 years old and came to Chicago after her big brother. Because the Chicago Jewish community was a very different place than all of New York when I visited. And quite frankly, I'm glad to come home. We don't have the kosher restaurant that we need on the south side anymore. You always got to go to Milton to try to do a little something to take someone out for a kosher meal. But it's just a very different animal. I had so many mentors from Dr. Byron Sherman, the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Spurs, to Arnie Wolf, who was one of the professors, Herman Shulman, Robert Marks, and the list just goes on and on and on. And I was very impressed by the leadership of the Jewish community. So much so until I thought that it was really the Mecca, or should have been the Mecca, for the Jewish community and being an example of how other communities should have been, Jewish communities should be interacting with African American communities in their particular cities, wherever they were located. What do you raise the issue about lack of connectedness? I connected because I reached out. And everybody that I reached out to in the Jewish community, no one withdrew their hand. They extended their hand. And that hand's extension was very important to me. Rabbi Reed, when we first met, and he said, you know, you were just at a congregation, but I was rabbi, one of the rabbis at. I said, really? He said, yeah. I served as rabbi at the temple for some years. I said, hey, I was just there. I said, that place is amazing. It had 5 rabbis or more. It had so many services, bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs going by. I said, boy, that had to be a hub. It was really a fantastic experience. But I was glad that Rabbi Reed reached out to me. And that's the type of spirit of connectedness that we had here in Chicago. The synagogue that we now operate out of, Beth Shalom at 6601 South Kedzie, was Lawn Manor Beth Jacob, another merger of 2 congregations on the southwest side. Rabbi Schultz, who built that synagogue, when the marchers for Dr. King were going down Kedzie Avenue, Rabbi Schultz said, you can use this synagogue as a safe haven for Dr. King, just in case he's attacked. Dr. King was attacked so viciously until he made the statement, I never faced the racism and the hatred anywhere in the South that I faced on the south side of Chicago this day. So Chicago's a unique community because Rabbi Schultz went against the wishes of many of his congregants by involvement with the civil rights movement. However, he said, I have to do this. And what I appreciate so much about it is that 6 blocks away was the headquarters of the American Nazi Party. And they used to practice in Marquette Park and had their marches in Marquette Park and their demonstrations in Marquette Park. So Rabbi Schultz stood about 5'4". But to me, He's a giant. And the other piece is that his grandson came down to a program that we had of celebrating the march in 1964. And today his grandson is a member of our congregation, Rabbi Schultz's grandson. So our community is an all-inclusive community. Ashkenazi Jews, biracial Jews, white Jews who adopted African-American children, Jews from the Philippines, Jews from Africa, Jews from the Caribbean. And we only have 200 people. All are always welcome at Beth Shalom. If you're coming through the door, you know how to put a tallis on. No one's gonna ask you if you're Jewish. If you know how to hold a siddur, the prayer book, no one is gonna ask if you're Jewish. Because all are welcome. And we assume, as I did when I was in Florida once, and I was seeking a congregation to daven at, and I found the congregation, and it was like 7:30 in the morning. And so I went in and davened and laid the building and prayer shawl. And so this lovely young lady said, "Oh my God, are you Jewish?" I said, "No." I found this stuff outside. And I wanted to come in to see how it worked. Of course I'm Jewish. You don't advertise. I had to find you. And you got no air conditioning in here. So when someone comes into your community, and I know that they're going to be welcome at KDM Isaiah, not only with open arms, but also with open hearts. And I pray that that tradition of so many of your members that I've known personally, the Ashleys, Sydney, Kay Bergson, oh my God, just love but lifting to death. Oh. These were and these are my friends. And we're friends for life. To work together, to stand together, to pray together, and if necessary, to fight together. That's where we stand. That's who I am. Last I want to say, this article was in Religion Dispatches. So it says, enjoy the kosher collard greens, but understand this. Israelites have something to say to the rest of the Jewish community. Articles written by Dr. Andre Key, Dr. Walter Isaacs, and Tamar Manasseh, a member of our congregation. Some of you may have gone down to work with her on the corner of 75th and Stewart, where she runs an organization called Mothers and Men Against Senseless Killings. And she's been there for 7.5 years and continuing to build that relationship. I think it's important. But we have a unique need. My bio says I'm the chief rabbi of the International Israelite Board of Rabbis. Most of the congregations are in New York City. A few congregations are in the Philadelphia region. Some are in the Atlanta area. Some are in North Carolina. We also have a congregation in Barbados, which I should eat now. Be out of this weather. But we're also working as a board member with an organization called Kulana, out of all of us together. The organization works with emerging communities around the world, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And Kulanu does great work. As a matter of fact, we just sponsored a sub-Saharan African conference, December 10th, I think, like the 18th. And we had African Jews from at least 9 countries on the continent. And many of the teachers were Ashkenazi Jews. One doctor came from Israel, he's a shochet, and was teaching Shekim how to slaughter animals kosherly. And they had wonderful times. There were parts of the service that were unique to the Ashkenazi Jews that were there, because if you go to an African service, if you come to our service, we're gonna play drums. We're going to shout, we're gonna sing. Our Judaism is immersed in our spirituality. And when I became a Jew, one guy said, my God, you're cursed twice. You're black and you're Jewish. I said, my God. In actuality, I've been twice blessed, as opposed to cursed twice. Because Judaism has afforded me and allowed me to take my intellect and my spirituality and to synthesize the two. And what is most important to me is the capacity and the ability to question. You may not have the answer, may not find the answer, but Jews don't shy away from the capacity to question. And having the ability to search. You learn more sometimes when you're searching for one thing, you'll learn a whole different school of thought on other things. So I'm deeply appreciative of being here today. I have to tell you, Jerry, your talk just overwhelmed me. It overwhelmed me when you spoke of the history of KM Isaiah, and you mentioned so many of the men that nurtured my development in the Jewish community in Chicago. And we're hoping to achieve the same work in New York City, where our community has now joined the New York Board of Rabbis. You know, that was a challenge. It took a couple of years. You do this, you do that, do that, do that. But thank God, Baruch Hashem, we got it done. Because I believe Kol Yisrael Ha'arevim Zeh B'Zeh, that we are all responsible for each other. And Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people, live. And we must live audaciously, bravely, and standing together against any form of racism, any form of anti-Semitism, no matter what quarter it comes from. And I'll add, I think I have 1 minute. What's the timekeeper?
Yeah.
I'll add this. I tried to tell the leader of the ADL, we met with a couple of weeks ago, Jonathan Greenblatt. Jonathan, he said, oh, Rabbi, I know you. You used to come to the White House for the Hanukkah party. I said, it was a lot of white people that I didn't. But it's like, I'm glad you remember. Okay. But just as you have so many layers of ultra-Orthodox Jews, Bad and Setmar, whatever, and modern Orthodox and conservative, reform, Reconstructionist, Jewish renewal, and even humanistic, I never get it, but that's okay. You have this variety of people who identify themselves as Black Hebrew Israelites, and by no stretch of the imagination are we all the same. Absolutely and unequivocally not. So you have to draw a stronger distinction on your language that you have on your website, talking about Black Hebrew Israelites. Because first thing people gonna ask me, hey, look, you Black. You use the term Israelite, so is that demeaning? And when you hear people say that they feel that they are connected to Judaism, to Israel, to Hebrewism, the transatlantic slave trade, it's not an impossibility. It's not an impossibility. Hebrewisms of West Africa, from the Nile to the Niger, with the Jews, written by a Catholic priest, Joseph Williams, first published in 1930, that traces the movement of the Jewish people in the interior of Africa, as well as the Mediterranean basin. So because some went in the Mediterranean way, others went into the interior. The Limba, the Igbo, the Igbo, the Yoruba, all of these people have Hebraic roots. And with that, so if you meet someone who looks like me, and they walk in and want to dive with me, and they know how to put on a talus, they know how to hold a siddur, please don't ask them if they're Jewish.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. I definitely want to come to your temple talking about not being asked if you're Jewish, not showing shock about being Jewish, really hit me. Like the others, you talked about connectedness through communication. And you talked about standing up for what's right, even when others disagree, and leave the temple, leave the neighborhood, but still doing the right thing. We are at the Q&A portion, and if you could, oh no, I'm sorry. So if you could give Larry your questions, and Ruth has some. And Erica, I don't know if you want to get started while they're, Erica will moderate. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Yeah.
Any garbage with my grandson.
Okay, as we're gathering questions from the in-person audience, questions from the virtual audience, I'd like to just throw a question out to all of the panelists. So, if you feel inspired by this question, feel free to answer and give your thoughts. What are some of the lessons that we can gather from the historical context that each of you has offered to help us become ever better at forming sustaining and developing community. What can we gather from what's already happened, right? From our local history, from our shared history, from our intersectional history? What do you think?
KM Isaiah is a unique congregation, so I believe that they have been reaching out and that they will continue to reach out. But it's in the broader Jewish community. There's not a lot of outreach, particularly to the African American community. In too many instances, there's mistrust as opposed to reaching out. And the other thing is, we need to reinvigorate from the Jewish community, particularly in other quarters in the Jewish community, in the Jewish world, in the United States. The ideals of Heschel and King must be emulated more. We can't simply talk about what Heschel did. It has to be emulated. Someone has to knock on a door. Someone has to send an email or a telephone call and say, I heard that you're having this issue. How can we help?
I just want to add one thing. I'm always picking up the isms from Reverend Jackson. And he always says that need is the basis of organization. So when we all need something, we can band together. He said self-interest is the sustaining force, and service is power. And if we band together based on need and stay together based on our own individual self-interest, the service we provide to others becomes our real power. And one of the things we can do together is all make sure that everyone registers to vote and then get them out.
Thank you so much, Rabbi and Betty. Rebecca, Jerry, any thoughts?
They're a possible vote for me.
I have a brief comment. One of the things that we were really struck by when we were doing the history was the extraordinary role of the sisterhoods of both congregations. And it seemed extremely important that they were already organized, that they had been organized for a long time. They were really social justice committees. And in particular, we were very fortunate that the minutes of every meeting of the Isaiah Israel Sisterhood from 1895 to the merger were preserved. And they had all been written in beautiful Palmer method. And the only thing we didn't know about the meetings was the names of the participants, because they always referred to themselves as Mrs. Sam Cohn and Mrs. Henry Goldstein. What we learned was, they had fought for suffrage during the Great Depression. They were the major fundraisers in the congregation, with bake sales and everything else to be able to make some payments on the mortgage. So they were very committed to action. And they were the people, more than the men, who did the day-to-day work of fighting for housing justice, which was the major issue. Interestingly, there was not much of a response by the congregations to Brown versus the Board of Education when that happened, at least as shown in the Temple bulletins for really until the 60s. School desegregation didn't come up, but housing was a major issue, and they kept working at it very hard. And the other issue that they were dealing with at the same time was McCarthyism. And they looked at them together. They looked at racial justice and civil liberties as kind of two peas in a pod. And they had, they would have like lunch meetings where they would bring experts to talk about one or both. And then you would see in the minutes that is, when the speakers were done, they would discuss, they would create a to-do list. And at the next meeting, the ladies would report on what they had done and they would develop a strategy. And we don't have that infrastructure anymore. Because, we don't have in congregations in general, that kind of standing group of people. We found that at KMII, the sisterhood started falling apart in the mid-70s as people started going to work, and the women in the 50s, the sisterhood was their job. And they really spent a great deal of time on it. So, the both good and bad thing is you have to create an ongoing organization to be able to deal with social justice issues, but it's much, much harder to create it today than it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even before.
Thank you. Thanks for your thoughts on that question. Okay. So I've got a question from the audience. So recognizing that the Black and Jewish communities are not mutually exclusive, do you think that your sense of the relationship between the Black and Jewish communities is the same for younger generations, is the same for the youth? What do you think about the dynamics or the sort of change or evolution of this relationship when it comes to, newer generations, younger generations?
May I just say, in having been in several marches, especially the March on Washington, I worked on it here in Illinois, and but I ended up going to DC for that first Women's March. And I have found in working, I work now with Chicago Votes, which is the young group here in Chicago that's been fighting to get voting in prisons, and they fought it. They go every other weekend and register incarcerated but not convicted people in the Cook County jail. Young people don't see the differences, what we did when I was growing up. And if you talk to young people of today, and I'm so glad they're gonna be the leaders of tomorrow, they don't appear to see Jewish or African American or Puerto Rican or Italian or Greek. They just see people, and they all work together, and they don't look at ethnicity. They don't think about gender. They don't care from LGBTQ. They don't care. They all work on one issue. So like now they're working on getting voting in prisons. It doesn't matter who's working on it with them. The bottom line is they're all going to Springfield and they're all lobbying. So I've gone to Springfield and lobbied with them. And I think they have a different perspective on life. And I don't know if they didn't learn from their parents. In my generation, white children learn the N-word. They don't learn that now. Their parents aren't. That's not where they are. And even if that is where the parents are, they don't care. They're on their own page and they're dealing with issues. They care about the climate. They want to make sure that we can live on this climate. It has nothing to do with whether you're black, white, purple, or pink. That's my experience with working with what I guess we call Gen Zers.
Got you. Thank you. Any other panelists?
Now that we know that Black Jews exist, there are issues that when you are trying to talk to the African American and Black community, it would be nice to invite a Black Jew to be a part of that conversation with the Jewish community. So that it's not, if you're not white, you're not Jewish, or how are you Jewish? We gotta cut that out. We have to cut that out. And making like the world is Ashkenazi Jewish. So it kind of tickles me sometimes when Jewish groups want to go and talk to Black folks and they know me. But I'm not part of the conversation. But yet somehow or another, you really want to reach back. Oh, but I must fall into a very different category. So leadership needs to think about this. And be more inclusive if you're really sincere about it. Particularly, my good friend, Dr. Gary Tobin, wrote the book, Opening the Gates, Proactive Conversion to Judaism. And he said many years ago that many of the organized Jewish communities, like federations across this country, what is the percentage of Black Jews on any of the federation boards? We have to examine that, and why not? We have to ask those questions. They may be difficult questions, but at least to ask the question. But simply to have the assumption that, you know, we don't matter.
Thank you. Any other panelists' thoughts on that question? Rebecca, Jerry? No? Okay. Okay, thank you for sharing your thoughts on the question. Okay, another question from the audience. Moving forward, how do our communities work together to fight growing anti-Semitism and racism? Any thoughts?
Okay, so Big Mouth said. We all have a consciousness and we all understand the difference in pardon my expression, idiots or people who have some mental issues or people who are just mean and hateful. That is not the majority of this country. And when we see people like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and Kanye West and others, we have to know that that's not the majority of the people in this country. But when they say things that are mean and hateful and spiteful, we have to speak up because silence gives consent. And we cannot act like whatever's horrible and nobody say anything. We, meaning everyone in this room, has a responsibility to speak out against hatred and bigotry and racism and anti-Semitism. Because if we, who are none of those things, don't say anything, it's like the old saying, I can't remember this whole script, but it's something about they came for.
Yeah.
First they came for the.
The microphone.
First, I remember along these lines.
Yes.
First, they came to the socialists and I wasn't one,
Yeah.
so I didn't pay any attention. Then they came for the Protestants who were too religious and I didn't pay any attention. And then they came for the working class people and I wasn't working class, so I didn't pay any attention. And then it was too late. And they came for
And
me.
they came for me,
And there was nobody left.
and there was nobody else.
And there was no one else left
To pay
after that.
attention. We have to keep that in mind.
Mhm.
Thanks for that. Helping me with that.
I wasn't, it wasn't all there, but I remember it.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts about this question? Okay, let's see. One more question from the audience. What are our mutual needs on the south side? What are our local needs that we can collaborate on, that we can build coalition on? What are some of those initiatives that you identify?
I think if you live in a neighborhood, there's a food there, but it doesn't matter whether you're black, white, or purple. You don't have fresh produce, you don't have grocery stores. And if they close the grocery store, you have an obligation to get another one in your neighborhood. And if the neighborhood closest to you doesn't have one, you have an obligation to fight to get one, because if their grocery store closes today, your grocery store is gonna close tomorrow. And they blame it on safety and crime and looting, and that's not true. They just don't wanna serve the community. That Whole Foods that opened in Inglewood, did it last a year? 18 months, whatever it was, and they closed it up. Was all this big deal, they got all these incentives and got all this money to open up a store in Inglewood. And then they closed it and left
With the money.
with the money. You are absolutely correct. So we have to do something. I'm telling you, silence gives consent. My grandmother always told me, if somebody's doing something wrong and you don't say anything, silence gives consent.
Thank you so much for your answer. Any other thoughts about this?
You know,
Amen.
just good.
Gotcha. So I've got a question actually for you, Emma. What are some of the Jewish moral and theological underpinnings of an effective approach to social justice? Of an effective approach to social justice? What are some of the values from our tradition that we can lean into to kind of fuel us in this work?
We can be like, I think the Talmud calls it Bithia. The one who adopted Moses. We read that this week. She was an Egyptian. But somewhere along the line, she must have taught Moses Hebrew. Moses didn't speak Hebrew. She was an Egyptian. But somewhere along the line, she had to teach Moses that those were his people when he went out amongst his people, amongst his brethren. Bithia was an interesting person. She adopted Moses, but she never wanted to, through adopting him, take him away from what was culturally his. She respected that culture. And even though her father had decreed to kill every Israelite male child, Bithia couldn't do that. So we need to be able to reach out to everyone and know that people are always standing there, willing to help. Now, how do we communicate to them that the help is needed? That's one of the issues. So Jewish value of, it's really, it was Egyptian, but yet that was a Jewish value when she adopted Moses and gave him a combined name, Moshe, both Egyptian and Hebrew, synthesizing this culture. So we have to take what we have and not be afraid to share.
Thank you so much for your answer. So that's the last of our questions for this evening. So I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you, Jerry, for your thoughts, your insights, your wisdom this evening. Thank you so much.
I was asked to just say a word or two about where we go from here. We started off by talking about how we were gonna talk about the bad stuff as well as the good stuff in the relationships between Black communities and I'll say white Jewish communities. I didn't hear too much of the bad stuff this evening. There was a lot of kumbaya, great stuff. And there was some great stuff to talk about. Rabbi, first of all, let me say it's always an honor to be with you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Rabbi talked about what a unique congregation this is, and I think that he is right. In the last 10 years, this congregation has gone from having 0 Jews of color on the board to having about 25% of the board Jews of color. We look at this panel. We've got 5 people sitting in this panel. 4 of them are people of color, and 3 of those people of color are Jews. If we had not had a woman of color who was Jewish running this show, I don't know what this panel would look like. So yes, I do think that this congregation is special and has done great work, but if we look at our country, we know that it's not always been so great in the last years. It has been said by others wiser than I that the illusion that the election of Barack Obama meant that we were in a post-racial society was one of white intellectuals who were out of touch. And we have seen in the years since he has left office how true that is. There are 2 events that I would point to that should serve as guiding lights for us, and I will list them chronologically. The first is the massacre at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston in 2015, in which 9 Black people were murdered. They were not murdered because of the words Emmanuel, Methodist, Episcopal, or church in the name of their community. They were murdered because of the word African in the name of their community. And the second is the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, at which 11 Jews were killed, and I'll say that they were white Jews who were killed, but they were not killed because they were white. They were killed because they were Jews. These 2 events show that our communities have good call to work together for the betterment of our society. We talked about the history of slavery and the history of the Holocaust and how that can be a touch point where communities can come together. I think we are all aware of instances where it has been used as a competition for who has suffered more. The fact that Black people have suffered much greater violence against their bodies in the history of this country than the Jewish community has should not lead us to separate. The competition and suffering in which the Holocaust or the history of persecution against Jews is pitted against slavery and the history of persecution against people of African descent is one which is useless. As we get further and further into the 21st century, we learn more and more that our communities share much. Black communities point to Jewish ancestry. Jewish communities are finally becoming aware that there are such a thing as Jews of color. And while I would not claim the history of the suffering of slavery as my own, I have members of my community who do claim that history. Why compare? Instead, let us forge the bond of King and Heckle that was referred to, observed honestly more in the talking about than in the doing of. Reverend Jesse Jackson, after anti-Semitic incidents here in Chicago several years ago, quickly came to our synagogue. We held a solidarity event together. He talked about sharing cell phone numbers with one another and being in contact with one another. We need to do that. I have said that the Jewish community needs help in order to make changes to our society because we are a small people. We should join communities together, bring in communities that share our perspectives so that we can change the despair which is in our society. Since we are doing this in part in respect of Dr. King, I'll quote him to close by saying, "Out of mountains of despair, we can bring a stone of hope. May we do so together."
Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to all of our panelists for coming. I do just wanna, let you know that we have some other social justice events coming up. We hope you will come to those too. We've got an, 175th birthday party with our George families, an anti-racism discussion. With Tanny Crow, creative director for the National Jewish Nonprofit, the Holashon, and DEI anti-racism educator. A food center celebration in our garden, another panel discussion, this one on immigration with Susan Besh, and an Into Action group volunteer activity. Stay tuned and please help us honor our 175th anniversary and our values of B'Tselem Elohim, inclusivity, and Tikkun Olam for repairing the world. Thank you again to you, and have a good night.